November 12th, 1986, the Norwegian Sea, 150 nautical miles north of the Kola Peninsula. The sun hasn't risen this far north in November. At this latitude and this time of year, the sky transitions from darkness to gray twilight and back to darkness without ever seeing true daylight. A United States Navy P-3 Orion Maritime Patrol aircraft from Patrol Squadron 8, call sign, Tiger 407, operates at 1,500 feet altitude, flying a carefully planned search pattern across waters where Soviet submarines transit as they depart their bases near Murmansk and head toward the Atlantic Ocean. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell commands the 11-person crew that's been airborne for 6 hours, having launched from Naval Air Station Keflavik in Iceland before dawn. This is Mitchell's 127th patrol mission over these waters. He knows the search patterns, understands the acoustic conditions, recognizes the subtle indications that suggest Soviet submarine presence. His crew operates with practiced efficiency. The tactical coordinator manages the overall mission. Sensor operators monitor radar and infrared systems. Acoustic operators analyze sonobuoy data streaming into their consoles. And the flight engineer manages the aircraft IS systems to ensure they can remain on station for the full 12-hour mission duration. At airweight 47 hours, the MAD, magnetic anomaly detector, mounted in the tail boom of the Orion triggers an alert. The equipment has detected a distortion in Earth's magnetic field, the characteristic signature created when a large metal object displaces the natural magnetic field lines. The distortion pattern matches a submarine, and the MADI computer calculates position, directly beneath the aircraft, approximately 400 feet deep. Mitchell immediately orders a mark on top, dropping a smoke marker to mark the exact position, and directs his tactical coordinator to begin the tracking sequence they've practiced hundreds of times. Within 3 minutes, acoustic operators have deployed the first pattern of sonobuoys, creating a grid of underwater hydrophones that will listen for the submarine. Within 5 minutes, they've identified the contact, a Soviet Victor III class nuclear attack submarine, one of the quietest submarines in the Soviet Navy, operating at moderate speed on a westerly course that will take it toward the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, where Soviet submarines transit to reach the Atlantic. Over the next 8 hours, Mitchell's crew will track this submarine continuously, maintaining contact through every evasion attempt the Soviet captain executes. They'll deploy 32 sonobuoys in successive patterns, each pattern designed to maintain acoustic coverage as the submarine maneuvers. They'll coordinate with a second P3 Orion that arrives to relieve them when Tiger 407 needs to return to Iceland for fuel, ensuring continuous tracking without gaps. They'll pass detailed tracking data to NATO forces, including position updates every 15 minutes, course, and speed estimates, an acoustic signature analysis that allows other forces to identify this specific submarine in future encounters. At 16:51 hours, the Soviet submarine surfaces 180 nautical miles from the initial detection point. NATO signals intelligence immediately intercepts radio communications from the submarine to Northern Fleet headquarters, and Commander Yuri Petrov's frustration is evident in the decoded message. These American aircraft are everywhere. We cannot hide from them regardless of what actions we take. Request instructions for continuing patrol mission under these conditions. This incident wasn't exceptional, it was routine. Throughout the 1980s, P3 Orion patrol squadrons maintained continuous coverage over strategic ocean areas where Soviet submarines operated, detecting and tracking the vast majority of Soviet submarine movements and fundamentally compromising Soviet naval strategy that depended on submarines operating undetected. To understand why Soviet submarine forces faced this problem, you need to understand what they were trying to achieve and why they believed the ocean would protect them. The Soviet Union invested enormous resources in submarine forces throughout the Cold War, building what became the world's largest submarine fleet. The Northern Fleet, based at Severomorsk and Polyarny on the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk, operated more than 60 nuclear-powered attack submarines and more than 30 ballistic missile submarines by the mid-1980s. The Pacific Fleet, based at Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, operated more than 40 submarines. These weren't just coastal defense forces. Soviet doctrine envisioned these submarines conducting offensive operations throughout the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, threatening NATO naval forces and interdicting the supply lines that would sustain European allies during any potential conflict. Soviet submarine strategy during the Cold War emphasized stealth and surprise. Soviet submarines would depart their bases transit through relatively narrow choke points like the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap in the Atlantic or straits near Japan in the Pacific, and disperse into open ocean areas where they would patrol undetected until called upon to execute wartime missions. The strategy depended fundamentally on submarines remaining undetected. If NATO forces could track Soviet submarines from the moment they departed their bases, Soviet strategic advantages would evaporate. Soviet submarine designers invested heavily in acoustic quieting technology, developing progressively quieter submarines with each generation. The Victor III class that Commander Petrov commanded represented Soviet best efforts at acoustic stealth, incorporating sound-dampening systems, improved reactor cooling that reduced pump noise, and propellers designed to minimize cavitation. Soviet confidence in submarine stealth wasn't baseless. The ocean is vast, acoustic propagation is complex and variable, and detecting quiet submarines in deep water presented enormous technical challenges. Soviet planners believed that even if NATO deployed extensive anti-submarine warfare forces, the sheer scale of ocean areas where Soviet submarines could operate would make comprehensive tracking impossible. Some Soviet submarines would inevitably be detected, but Soviet doctrine assumed most submarines would complete patrols undetected if they operated carefully. This assumption proved catastrophically optimistic once P-3 Orion patrol aircraft began establishing comprehensive coverage over strategic transit areas. Soviet anti-submarine warfare aircraft existed, but operated with significant capability limitations compared to American equivalents. The Tupolev Tu-142 Bear F, the Soviets' primary maritime patrol aircraft, was a capable platform but suffered from sensor and processing limitations that prevented it from matching P-3 Orion effectiveness. The Tu-142 carried sonobuoys and magnetic anomaly detection equipment, but coordination between these systems required manual operations by crew members rather than computer integration. The aircraft's acoustic processing capability allowed it to monitor only a handful of sonobuoys simultaneously, whereas P-3 Orions processed dozens of sonobuoys at once. Soviet doctrine emphasized using Tu-142 aircraft in coordination with surface ships that would provide additional sensors and targeting data, creating a coordinated anti-submarine warfare effort. But this approach required multiple platforms operating together, creating complexity that limited operational effectiveness compared to the P-3's self-contained capability. The Ilyushin Il-38 May, Soviet Naval Aviation's other maritime patrol aircraft, the Lockheed P-3. Orion, that would create decisive American advantages in anti-submarine warfare, evolved from an unlikely origin, a commercial airliner. In the late 1950s, the United States Navy needed to replace its aging P-2 Neptune maritime patrol aircraft with a platform offering greater endurance, better sensors, and improved operational capability. Lockheed proposed adapting its Electra commercial airliner for the maritime patrol mission. The Electra was a proven, reliable platform with excellent range and endurance characteristics. Lockheed engineers removed the pressurization and passenger accommodations, added weapons bays and sensor equipment, and created the P-3A that first flew in November 1959. The P-3A entered operational service in 1962, providing immediate improvements over previous generation maritime patrol aircraft. But the P-3A was just the beginning. Lockheed and the Navy continuously refined the design, adding more sophisticated sensors and processing systems with each variant. The P-3B introduced improved acoustic processing and expanded sonobuoy capacity. The P-3C, which entered service in 1969, represented a revolution in maritime patrol capability. The P-3C integrated multiple sensor systems with computer processing that allowed the aircraft to detect, track, and engage multiple submarines simultaneously at ranges that previous generation aircraft couldn't approach. The sensor suite aboard P-3C was comprehensive and sophisticated. The AN/APS-115 surface search radar, mounted in the aircraft's nose, provided detection capability against surface targets at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles. The radar could detect ships, surfaced submarines, periscopes, and snorkels, the breathing tubes submarines raised to run diesel engines or ventilate while remaining mostly submerged. Experienced radar operators could identify submarine periscopes at ranges beyond 40 miles under favorable conditions, and detecting snorkeling submarines was routine at similar ranges. The radar provided the first detection layer, allowing P-3 crews to survey enormous ocean areas and identify any submarine that exposed any part of itself above the surface. The magnetic anomaly detector represented fundamentally different detection technology. The MAD equipment, mounted in an extended tail boom to isolate it from the aircraft's own magnetic signature, measured distortions in Earth's magnetic field. Submarines are large metal objects containing enormous quantities of ferromagnetic materials, steel hull structures, machinery equipment. When submarines displace Earth's natural magnetic field, they create detectable anomalies that MAD equipment can sense. The detection requires the aircraft to fly directly over or very close to the submarine, and the submarine needs to be relatively shallow. MAD effectiveness drops dramatically beyond approximately 115 and 100 feet depth. But within these constraints, MAD provided definitive detection that couldn't be evaded through acoustic quieting or any submarine stealth measures. If a submarine was present within MAD detection range, the equipment would register the magnetic anomaly. P-3 crews used MAD primarily for localization, confirming that acoustic contacts detected through sonobuoys actually represented submarines, rather than biological sources or other false contacts. The sonobuoy system provided the P-3's primary submarine detection and tracking capability. Sonobuoys are small, expendable devices airdropped from the aircraft that float on the surface while deploying hydrophones beneath the water to listen for underwater sounds. The P3C carried 84 sonobuoys in external storage tubes, providing enough capacity for extended patrol missions. The sonobuoys came in multiple types, optimized for different tactical situations. Passive sonobuoys simply listened, detecting sounds generated by submarines, machinery noise, propeller cavitation, flow noise as water moves over the submarine's hull. Advanced passive sonobuoys could detect quiet submarines at ranges exceeding 20 nautical miles under favorable acoustic conditions. Active sonobuoys transmitted sonar pulses and listened for echoes, providing precise localization but alerting the submarine that it was being tracked. Directional passive sonobuoys, DFAR in U.S. Navy terminology, could determine the bearing to detected sounds, allowing P3 crews to triangulate submarine positions by analyzing bearings from multiple sonobuoys. The acoustic processing system that analyzed sonobuoy data represented the P3C's revolutionary advantage over previous maritime patrol aircraft and Soviet equivalents. The AN-AQA7 DFAR processor could analyze data from 32 sonobuoys simultaneously, processing acoustic signals through sophisticated filtering that isolated submarine signatures from ocean background noise. The system displayed acoustic data to operators at dedicated consoles where they could observe sound patterns, identify specific frequency signatures characteristic of submarines, and track changes over time that indicated submarine movement. The computer processing allowed operators to maintain awareness of complex tactical situations with multiple submarines operating in the same area, something previous generation systems requiring manual analysis simply couldn't achieve. Forward-looking infrared sensors provided additional detection capability against specific scenarios. FLIR systems detected thermal signatures, and submarines occasionally created detectable thermal patterns. Exhaust gases when snorkeling, thermal wakes in the water column from reactor cooling systems, even heat signatures from submarine hulls that had been on the surface and retained warmth from sunlight. FLIR detection was specialized and situational, but it provided another layer in the comprehensive sensor coverage that made evading detection increasingly difficult for submarine crews. The P3C crew configuration reflected the complexity of operating all these systems simultaneously. The aircraft carried 11 personnel, pilot and co-pilot who flew the aircraft and managed communications, a flight engineer who monitored aircraft systems and ensured the platform could remain on station for extended missions, a tactical coordinator who managed the overall mission and directed the search effort, 3 sensor operators who controlled radar, MAD, and other non-acoustic systems, 3 acoustic operators who analyzed sonobuoy data and tracked submarines, and 2 observers who provided additional situational awareness and assisted with various tasks. Crew members trained for hundreds of hours to develop proficiency with their systems and learn to coordinate effectively with other crew members. A well-trained P3 crew operated like a precision instrument, each member contributing specialized expertise, while the tactical coordinator orchestrated their collective efforts into coherent anti-submarine warfare operations. The P3 Orion's endurance capabilities were equally important to its sensor suite. The aircraft could remain on station, orbiting a patrol area and actively searching for submarines, for more than 12 hours at ranges exceeding 1,500 nautical miles from its base. This endurance allowed P3 crews to thoroughly search vast ocean areas, maintain continuous tracking once submarines were detected, and provide persistent coverage that denied Soviet submarines the opportunity to evade by simply waiting for patrol aircraft to leave the area. Soviet submarines attempting to evade P3 tracking would maneuver, change depth, reduce speed, and wait, hoping the patrol aircraft would exhaust its fuel and depart. But P3 crews could orbit for 10 or 12 hours, maintaining contact throughout, and when one P3 needed to return to base for fuel, another P3 would arrive to continue tracking without gaps. The weapon's capability rounded out the P3's comprehensive anti-submarine warfare functionality. The internal weapons bay carried 8 Mark 46 torpedoes, self-guiding weapons specifically designed to engage submarines. External wing pylons could carry additional torpedoes, mines, or other ordnance depending on mission requirements. The combination of detection, tracking, and engagement capability meant a single P3 could complete the entire anti-submarine warfare cycle independently. Detect a submarine, track it to establish accurate position and movement, and engage it with torpedoes if combat conditions existed. During peacetime operations, P3 crews conducted everything except the actual torpedo launch, maintaining training proficiency while conducting surveillance missions that tracked Soviet submarines and gathered intelligence about their operations. The Cold War operations that P3 Orion squadrons conducted throughout the 1970s and 1980s established patterns that fundamentally shaped NATO naval strategy and Soviet submarine operations. The NATO barrier patrol concept created continuous coverage over strategic ocean areas where Soviet submarines had to transit. The GUK gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, represented the primary Atlantic choke point where Soviet submarines departing the Kola Peninsula had to pass to reach open Atlantic waters. NATO established patrol sectors throughout this area, with P3 Orion squadrons from Iceland, Scotland, and Norway maintaining overlapping coverage 24 hours per day, 365 days per year. Soviet submarines departing their bases knew they would face this barrier, but Soviet doctrine assumed some submarines would slip through undetected. The actual detection rates proved much higher than Soviet planners anticipated. A typical P3 mission during this era followed established patterns refined through years of operations. The crew would launch from Naval Air Station Keflavik, Iceland, the primary P3 base supporting Atlantic barrier operations. They would transit 300 nautical miles to their assigned patrol area, a section of ocean where Soviet submarines were likely to transit based on intelligence assessments and previous detection patterns. Upon reaching the patrol area, the crew would begin deploying sonobuoys and barrier patterns, lines of passive sonobuoys positioned across likely submarine routes, creating acoustic detection coverage that Soviet submarines would pass through as they transited westward. The crew would orbit the patrol area, monitoring the sonobuoys for any acoustic contact that suggested submarine presence. Detection often occurred within 20 minutes of establishing the sonobuoy barrier. Soviet submarines transiting these waters couldn't avoid making some acoustic signature, and the sensitive hydrophones deployed by P3 crews detected that noise at ranges where submarines didn't know they were being monitored. Once acoustic operators identified a contact that appeared to be a submarine, the tactical coordinator would direct additional sonobuoy deployments to localize the contact and confirm classification. The crew would establish the submarine's course and speed, deploy additional sonobuoys ahead of the submarine's projected track to maintain continuous coverage, and begin the tracking phase that could last many hours. Soviet submarines, once they realized they'd been detected, would attempt standard evasion procedures. They would execute deep dives, descending to depths where Soviet doctrine suggested acoustic detection would be more difficult. P3 crews would maintain contact through passive sonobuoys that continued detecting machinery noise even at 1,000 feet depth or deeper. Soviet submarines would execute bottom-sitting maneuvers, finding locations where they could settle onto the ocean floor and remain completely silent, hoping the P3 would exhaust its fuel and depart before they needed to move. P3 crews would orbit the contact area for 12 hours or more, and when the first aircraft needed to return to base, a second P3 would arrive to continue coverage. Soviet submarines would attempt high-speed runs, accelerating to maximum speed in attempts to outrun sonobuoy coverage and escape the detection area. P3 crews would deploy additional sonobuoys ahead of the submarine's track, maintaining coverage regardless of submarine speed. The comprehensive nature of P3 tracking operations became clear through specific examples that NATO intelligence documented throughout the Cold War. During a 1984 exercise in the Norwegian Sea, a single P3C crew successfully tracked 4 Soviet submarines simultaneously, 3 Victor-class attack submarines and 1 Charlie-class cruise missile submarine, maintaining continuous contact with all 4 boats for more than 8 hours. The crew deployed sonobuoy patterns that covered all 4 submarines' operating areas, analyzed acoustic data from more than 30 active sonobuoys simultaneously, and provided position updates to NATO forces every 15 minutes for each contact. Soviet submarine commanders, unaware that a single aircraft was tracking all 4 boats simultaneously, executed independent evasion maneuvers that the P3 crew countered through coordinated sonobuoy deployments and acoustic analysis. When the submarines finally surfaced or entered port, Soviet intelligence assessed that NATO forces had maintained comprehensive awareness of all 4 submarines throughout their operations. In 1987, P3 Orions detected a Soviet Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine departing the Kola Peninsula for patrol operations in the Atlantic. The initial detection occurred when the submarine transited relatively shallow waters near the coast, where acoustic conditions favored detection and the submarine couldn't dive deep enough to evade monitoring. P3 crews tracked the submarine continuously as it transited westward through the Norwegian Sea, passing detailed tracking data to NATO forces. USS Los Angeles, an American attack submarine positioned along the Yankee-class submarine's projected route, received the tracking data and established contact with the Soviet submarine shortly after it passed through the Gyuk Gap. The American attack submarine shadowed the Soviet boat for its entire 30-day patrol, maintaining close enough contact to gather detailed acoustic intelligence while remaining undetected by the Soviet crew. When the Yankee-class submarine returned to its base, Soviet intelligence officers debriefing the crew learned that the submarine had been tracked by P-3 aircraft during departure, but believed they had evaded detection once they entered the Atlantic. They had no knowledge that an American attack submarine had shadowed them throughout their patrol, demonstrating how P-3 initial detection enabled comprehensive NATO tracking of Soviet submarine operations. Soviet frustration with P-3 Orion operations became evident through signals intelligence that NATO forces collected throughout the 1980s. Intercepted communications from Soviet submarine commanders to their headquarters repeatedly referenced American patrol aircraft that seemed omnipresent, impossible to evade, and capable of maintaining contact regardless of evasion attempts. Submarine commanders reported that surfacing for communications or snorkeling to recharge batteries resulted in near-certain detection by P-3 radar. Commanders complained that even when operating completely silently at depth, American aircraft somehow maintained awareness of their positions. Soviet Northern Fleet headquarters received so many reports of persistent P-3 tracking that they commissioned studies attempting to understand how American maritime patrol forces achieved such comprehensive coverage and what countermeasures Soviet submarines could employ. The post-Cold War period provided opportunities for direct assessment of P-3 effectiveness through discussions between NATO and Russian naval officers as military cooperation replaced confrontation. Russian submarine force commanders acknowledged in these discussions that P-3 Orions had detected an estimated 85 to 90% of Soviet submarine operations in Atlantic approaches during the 1980s. This detection rate fundamentally compromised Soviet submarine strategy because submarines that were tracked from departure couldn't achieve the strategic surprise Soviet doctrine depended upon. Even submarines that eventually evaded P-3 tracking after entering the Atlantic operated with reduced effectiveness because they knew NATO forces had initial awareness of their deployment and likely general understanding of their patrol areas. The capability gap between P-3 Orion and Soviet maritime patrol aircraft extended across multiple dimensions, reflecting cumulative American advantages in sensor technology, computer processing, systems integration, and operational doctrine. The sensor integration advantage was perhaps most significant. P-3C systems fused data from MAD, sonobuoys, radar, and other sensors into a single tactical picture that operators could visualize and act upon. Soviet Tu-142 systems required manual coordination between separate systems, with operators verbally communicating between workstations and manually plotting information on paper charts. This manual coordination introduced delays of 5 to 10 minutes between detection and coordinated response, allowing submarines opportunities to evade before Soviet crews could establish comprehensive tracking. Sonobuoy technology represented another critical gap. American passive sonobuoys employed advanced hydrophones that could detect quiet submarines at ranges exceeding 20 nautical miles under favorable acoustic conditions. Soviet equivalent sonobuoys were effective at ranges below 10 miles, requiring Soviet aircraft to deploy more sonobuoys to achieve equivalent coverage, and creating higher probability that submarines would detect sonobuoy deployment and execute evasion before Soviet crews established contact. The difference wasn't just detection range. American sonobuoys incorporated signal processing that filtered background noise and enhanced submarine signatures, while Soviet sonobuoys provided raw acoustic data that operators had to analyze manually. Processing capability differences compounded these sensor advantages. The P3C-AN AQA7 acoustic processor could analyze data from 32 sonobuoys simultaneously, using computer algorithms to correlate signals, filter noise, and present operators with processed information highlighting submarine signatures. Soviet acoustic processing systems could monitor approximately 8 sonobuoys maximum, and analysis was primarily manual. Operators listened to audio feeds from sonobuoys and attempted to identify submarine sounds through experience and judgment. This manual approach worked but created high false alarm rates as operators classified biological sounds, shipping noise, or oceanographic phenomena as potential submarine contacts. American computer processing filtered most false contacts automatically, allowing operators to focus on genuine submarine signatures. Operational tempo differences further amplified American advantages. The United States Navy maintained more than 12 P-3 patrol squadrons by the mid-1980s, with total operational inventory exceeding 120 aircraft at any given time. These squadrons conducted continuous barrier patrols over strategic areas, providing persistent coverage that denied Soviet submarines opportunities to transit unobserved. Soviet Tu-142 Maritime Patrol Force consisted of approximately 20 operational aircraft, limited by production constraints and maintenance challenges. Soviet aircraft conducted intermittent patrols when required, but couldn't maintain the continuous coverage American forces established. The difference meant American forces could track Soviet submarines consistently, while Soviet forces could only observe American submarine operations occasionally when aircraft happened to be in the right area at the right time. Training differences reflected and reinforced these capability gaps. United States Navy P-3 crews flew 200-plus hours annually, with substantial portions of that training conducted against American submarines, deliberately making themselves detectable so P-3 crews could practice detection, tracking, and engagement procedures under realistic conditions. Soviet Tu-142 crews flew 50 to 80 hours annually due to budget constraints and fuel limitations, with very limited opportunities to train against actual submarines, because Soviet submarine commanders were reluctant to expose their boats to extensive surveillance even during training. The training hour disparity meant American crews developed proficiency through extensive practice, while Soviet crews operated with limited experience. The industrial base supporting these operations revealed fundamental differences in sustainability. Lockheed produced more than 650 P-3 Orion aircraft between 1962 and 1990, creating substantial inventory that allowed the Navy to maintain high operational availability despite aircraft being committed to maintenance, upgrades, or repair. P-3 availability rates typically exceeded 95%, meaning nearly all aircraft not undergoing scheduled maintenance were available for operational missions. Soviet production managed fewer than 50 Tu-142 aircraft total, and availability rates hovered around 70% due to maintenance problems and parts shortages. The difference meant American forces could sustain continuous operations indefinitely, while Soviet forces struggled to maintain even intermittent patrol coverage. The P-3. Orion established maritime patrol standards that NATO and allied nations adopted throughout the Cold War and beyond. The aircraft remained in United States Navy service until 2023, with final retirement occurring only after more than 6 decades of operations. Allied nations including Canada, Australia, Japan, and multiple European countries operated P-3 variants, creating comprehensive maritime patrol coverage across all oceans where NATO interests required submarine surveillance. The operational success during the Cold War validated the concept of integrated sensor platforms with computer processing as the foundation for effective anti-submarine warfare, establishing doctrine and operational approaches that persist in modern maritime patrol operations. The Boeing P-8 Poseidon that replaced the P-3 in United States Navy service incorporates lessons learned from 6 decades of P-3 operations, while adding modern networked sensors, improved processing, and space-based cueing from reconnaissance satellites. The P-8 represents evolutionary improvement rather than revolutionary change, because the P-3 established fundamentally correct concepts that modern technology enhances rather than replaces. Other nations developing maritime patrol capabilities study P-3 operations as the standard to match, recognizing that American Cold War success in anti-submarine warfare stemmed from comprehensive sensor integration and sustained operational commitment that P-3 squadrons exemplified. Russian Navy continues operating Tu-142 aircraft with marginal improvements to sensors and processing, but Russian naval aviation commanders have acknowledged in professional forums during the 2010s that they cannot achieve P-3 equivalent anti-submarine warfare effectiveness with current technology. The sensor sophistication, processing capability, and systems integration that American industry developed for P-3 operations in the 1960s and 1970s remain beyond Russian current production capacity, creating persistent gaps that decades of attempted improvement haven't closed. The historical impact of P-3 Orion operations during the Cold War extended beyond just submarine tracking to fundamental strategic effects. Soviet submarine force doctrine assumed submarines could operate undetected if crews maintained discipline and submarines incorporated adequate acoustic quieting. P-3 barrier patrols demonstrated this assumption was false. Comprehensive maritime patrol coverage could detect and track the majority of submarine operations, regardless of stealth measures Soviet designers implemented. This reality forced Soviet naval planners to maintain larger submarine forces to achieve the same strategic effect they had planned to accomplish with fewer submarines, because if 85 to 90% of submarines were tracked from departure, the Soviet Navy needed more submarines to ensure enough untracked submarines existed to threaten NATO forces effectively. This requirement imposed substantial costs on Soviet naval budgets and diverted resources from other capabilities. NATO's confidence in submarine tracking capability shaped alliance strategy throughout the Cold War. NATO planners knew they could monitor Soviet submarine departures, track submarines through transit areas, and maintain general awareness of where Soviet submarine forces operated. This knowledge allowed NATO to plan anti-submarine warfare operations more efficiently, position forces more effectively, and operate with confidence that Soviet submarines couldn't achieve complete surprise. The strategic stability this provided was significant. NATO didn't need to assume worst-case scenarios where Soviet submarine forces appeared unexpectedly in strategic locations, because P-3 surveillance provided sufficient awareness that NATO forces would have warning of major submarine movements. Post-Cold War assessment of submarine warfare throughout the 1990s and 2000s confirmed that no adversary had achieved maritime patrol capability comparable to American P-3 operations. The United States and NATO allies maintained decisive advantages in submarine detection and tracking that shaped naval operations during conflicts throughout this period. P-3 aircraft conducted anti-submarine warfare operations during multiple regional conflicts, provided surveillance supporting naval operations, and established ocean domain awareness that ensured American and Allied forces maintained comprehensive understanding of submarine activities in any area where they operated. Modern relevance of P-3 success continues shaping naval development worldwide. China has invested substantial resources developing the Y-8Q maritime patrol aircraft, attempting to replicate P-3 capability and establish maritime patrol forces capable of monitoring submarine operations in the Western Pacific. Chinese maritime patrol development studies P-3 operations extensively, copying configuration concepts and attempting to achieve similar sensor integration. But Chinese aircraft continue operating with sensors and processing inferior to P-3 capability from the 1970s and 1980s, illustrating how difficult achieving comprehensive maritime patrol effectiveness remains even when concepts and requirements are well understood. The cumulative advantages in sensor technology, acoustic processing, systems integration, and crew training that made P-3 successful require capabilities that adversaries struggle to replicate decades after American forces demonstrated the operational concepts. When Commander Yuri Petrov's Victor III-class submarine surfaced in November 1986 after 8 hours of failed evasion attempts, Soviet naval intelligence officers debriefing him recognized the larger pattern his experience illustrated. American P-3 Orion maritime patrol forces had created transparency in ocean areas Soviet doctrine assumed were opaque. Soviet submarines could not operate undetected when P-3 aircraft established patrol barriers across transit routes. Soviet evasion tactics, deep diving, bottom-sitting, high-speed runs, emissions control could not defeat comprehensive sensor coverage that P-3 crews maintained through integrated radar, MAD, and sonobuoy operations. The ocean that Soviet planners believed would protect their submarines had become an environment where American technology created decisive advantages in detection and tracking. The strategic implications resonated throughout Soviet naval planning for the remainder of the Cold War. Soviet submarine commanders operated with knowledge that P-3 aircraft would likely detect their departures, track their transit through strategic choke points, and maintain general awareness of their operations. This knowledge forced Soviet submarines to operate more cautiously, reducing their effectiveness and limiting their ability to achieve the strategic surprise Soviet doctrine depended upon. The submarines themselves weren't failures. Soviet submarines were capable platforms operated by skilled crews. But they operated in an environment where American maritime patrol capability had created conditions fundamentally unfavorable to submarine stealth, and no amount of tactical proficiency could overcome that strategic disadvantage. Soviet submarines ruled the depths, maintaining capability to operate effectively once they reached patrol areas and evaded initial detection. But P-3 Orion aircraft ruled the oceans from above, maintaining persistent surveillance that detected submarines during their most vulnerable transit phases, and establishing tracking that compromised submarine effectiveness regardless of how well submarines performed once they reached operational areas. The competition between submarine stealth and maritime patrol detection capability decisively favored detection during the Cold War, and P-3 Orion represented the platform that established American dominance in that competition. Soviet submarines ruled depths, P-3 Orion ruled oceans from above,